Another episode of the Zero Podcast. Thanks to my man CJ. See if you can get a fist in the video. Bam! CJ is the media team here for the Zero channel, and he's going to be helping us out make some better content, including the filming of this podcast. I don't know if you can tell, but I look amazing in this video. And it's not me, it's the videography. So thank you, CJ. All right, today I'm going to talk about the subject of injuries, one of the most requested topics for this podcast that I've received so far is the idea of training through injuries. I'm not going to talk about training through injuries because that's a bad topic to talk about. So I'm going to talk about injuries more generally. And I want to start this episode off by making a case for therapists. I feel like, especially in the last sort of 5 years, therapists cop a lot of unnecessary flack from either do-gooder lifters or do-gooder coaches. And what I mean by that is, like, how often do we hear the term, oh, I went to X therapist and they were shit because they told me to just stop lifting. So what I mean when I say I want to make a case for these therapists is that you have to remember what a therapist's role is in this situation. The therapist's role is to provide you the best information that they can with the knowledge and the skills and the tools that they have. And it's also to cover their own ass. So if you go to a therapist and they're unfamiliar with lifting and you're like, hey, I've messed up my back. And they're like, how did you do that? And you're like, I did it deadlifting. Guess what they're going to say? They're going to say, well, stop doing that thing. Because if they tell you to continue to do that thing and you mess your back up even more, who's responsible? It's probably going to fall back on them. So they're just doing the best they can with the knowledge, the skills, the tools that they have, just like any coaches, just like any practitioner is as well. So when it comes to who you're going to see in this circumstance, the gold standard is going to be a physiotherapist. Their job is going to be to sort of identify and diagnose what the injury is and then provide the rehabilitation strategy for you to return back to your chosen activity, in this case, lifting. So the first thing after that we need to cover is the complexity of injury. The complexity of where injury comes from, the complexity of how it occurs. It's not as simple as you were lifting too heavy, you got hurt. You were lifting with bad technique, you got hurt. You were tired, you got hurt. Really, it's a combination of any number of given factors. It's unpredictable. You don't know when an injury is going to occur. However, there are markers of risk that we can talk about. And most of those markers of risk are things that either heighten the intensity or heighten the relative intensity. So, technique is going to come into that. Fatigue is going to come into that. General load management is going to come into that, but it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all. And then if we throw another factor into the mix, something like performance-enhancing drugs, now you've got this extra boost on the capacity that you can put into a lift, which is going to exacerbate all those other factors. Really, there's not enough time in a short episode like this to go into all the things that can lead to an injury. But what we can sort of identify and understand is that it's a very complex issue. It's unpredictable. Our job as coaches, our job as lifters is to try and minimize the risk of injury if and where possible. The cool thing about that is that process is not injury specific. It's performance specific. So what I mean by that is, like, as a coach, if CJ comes to see me and he's like, hey man, I want to be as strong as possible. I'm not going to say, all right, well, the first thing we need to do is make you as safe as possible. The first thing I'm going to do is, like, let's put you into a system that I believe is the gold standard of movement and a programming structure that I believe is the gold standard of programming structure. And inherently within that design is going to the best of my knowledge, minimize injury risk. So trying to make someone as strong as possible should be part and parcel with making that person as injury resilient as possible. That is working on movement patterns. That is managing load so the person can train at a relatively high intensity all the time. That is structuring deloads or knowing when to structure in a deload if you do it reactively. So we don't really have to think too much about what is the safest way to move weight, because inherently that should be the strongest way. And again, because we don't completely know exactly what leads to an injury, we just have ideas. That means that if we can just focus on building the best athlete in terms of their performance, in terms of managing their fatigue and their load and everything like that, then we can ideally see less injury rates occurring. Now, here's where we sort of lead into, I guess, along the lines of the idea of training through an injury. The idea of training through an injury, to me, the reason I don't like that subject too much, it's a little bit ambiguous. It sort of suggests that you get hurt and you just do whatever you can to continue training. And I think there is some merit to that, but there's definitely a smart way to do it and a really dumb way to do it. So first point of call, if you've sustained an injury, I guess is addressing the psychology that comes with injury. There's a few things that happen when you get hurt, especially if you're unfamiliar with being hurt. The first thing you're going to do is probably panic and feel an immense sense of regret and immense desire to go backwards in time and not be hurt. It's kind of like, when you got a blocked nose and you're like, I wish I could go back to a time where I didn't have a blocked nose, which is like 3 days ago. That's kind of how it feels when you get hurt. Immediately you want to not be hurt. The quicker we can get past that stage and realize, okay, this thing has happened. It may not necessarily have a reason as to why it's happened, but here is my baseline now. My baseline is I've sustained an injury. Now we can start to focus on what's to come, because you will return from an injury. No matter how big or small that injury is, chances are you're going to continue, you're going to come back, you're going to return. The daunting thing about sustaining an injury as well is that it tends to minimize time. So what I mean by that is like, you get caught in this vacuum of like, I'm hurt, oh no, I'm familiar with this injury, this is going to be like a 6-month rehab process or something like that. You start to think that 6 months is a lot of time. Ask yourself, when did I start lifting? You probably got a start date. Yeah, 5 years ago. Ask yourself, when are you going to stop? You don't have an end date. You want to keep lifting, you want to keep getting stronger. So 6 months in the grand scheme of the next 20 years is nothing. And if anything, it's a great learning opportunity for you to go through and focus on all the things that may have led to that injury. The first point of call when it comes to sustaining an injury is figuring out what it is and figuring out what the rehab process looks like. Too often, people confuse rehabilitation with return to baseline. So what I mean by that is like, you get hurt, you go through a rehabilitation, you assume that you're back to where you were before you got hurt. No, what rehabilitation is returning to a baseline of no pain, returning to a baseline of being able to perform the task. That might not be intensity specific. So if you hurt your back doing a deadlift, the rehabilitation process is to get you back to doing a deadlift with no pain. If you hurt your back doing a 300 kilo deadlift, maybe the rehabilitation process is to get you back to doing 60 kilo deadlifts with no pain. That doesn't mean on that day you can go up to 300 kilos. And so often this is where people come unstuck through this injury process. They get back to a point where they can complete the task with no pain, and then they start to test the waters too soon. The other big hole we have in this whole return to performance, this whole return from injury process in this industry, is the absence of a gold standard of movement. So again, we can't blame movement completely for the cause of an injury, but it can be a great predictor. Obviously load management is going to come into it, but how you move and load management can really be intertwined as the same thing. That is, if you're moving in an inefficient way, in an inefficient manner, in a manner that's loading up structures more than they should be loaded up, it makes sense eventually for those structures to undergo some trauma and potentially lead to an injury. It's not the absolute, but it could be tied up in that. So part of the rehabilitation people often miss is not being able to identify if the way that they were moving was the thing that led to the injury. And so what they do is go through a rehab process where they return to a baseline of no pain and then start reloading that movement in exactly the same way they were doing that caused the injury or that led to the injury in the first place. And this is really common, especially with disc-based injuries or facet joint strains, anything in the lower back or the spine, where people are moving in a particular way, they hurt their back, now that injury exists whether they want it to or not, and you need to strengthen the structures around it, retrain the movement. They don't retrain the movement, and so they go back into loading in that same movement pattern. 6 months down the track, they sustain the same injury and get caught in this cycle of recurring injury in the same spot. If that's the case, we could probably, with a high degree of accuracy, pinpoint to where in that movement they're breaking down to the point that's leading to this recurring injury. Again, we can't say it with absolute certainty, but we can be pretty sure. And I can say that confidently just with anecdotal experience that I've seen in this industry, working with thousands of lifters over the years. One thing that really has to be paid attention to if you've sustained an injury, you've gone through the rehabilitation process, you've returned to a baseline of no pain, not necessarily complete strength or complete loading, but no pain. Sometimes you need to re-look at the movement that's caused the injury and ask yourself the question, is there something I can do about this to make sure that this injury doesn't recur? Is there something I can change or modify about my movement to ensure that this injury doesn't happen again? And that's where we often become unstuck, A, because there's no gold standard of movement, and B, because a lot of people just don't know. They can't look at a movement and be like, oh, there's the cascade of events that led to this breakdown, that led to me sustaining an injury in this area because it was overloaded. It's a little bit hard for the average person to pick it up. It's hard for the average coach to pick it up, again, because of this absence of the gold standard. So that's a good general overview of talking about injury. I think it's really important now to revisit that psychology aspect again, like especially if you've never had experienced an injury before. It's so easy to panic, especially in certain areas of the body as well. So like we are conditioned from a very early age to believe that if you feel something in your lower back, you've got spine Ebola and your spine's going to explode and you're going to die. Like if you hurt your lower back, that's game over. And it's just really not the case. So like when you sustain a lower back injury, especially something relatively tame, like a basic facet joint strain or something, facet joint strain pain is like 10 out of 10. It sucks and you feel like you're going to die. It's only once you've gone through the experience or had exposure to the experience of this injury in the rehab process that you start to appreciate the fact that these things are actually little blips in your lifting life that you can get past. And often if you do get past with the right attitude and approach, you come out of it on the other side as a better lifter, understanding the process, respecting the process a little bit more. Hope that helps. If you need any more specific information on any of this stuff, feel free to reach out. Always happy to talk about it. I will talk to you next time.